federal funds that you're receiving or administering matter. And it touches on it a little bit. There's not direct guidance for any particular source of federal funds per se, but I want to remind everybody of our 30B hotline for technical assistance to call with regard to compliance with state law, and also our procurement bulletin, which is a resource for public employees that are following the Uniform Procurement Act and may have questions. There's a frequently asked questions section to that, as well as other helpful information related to preventing and detecting fraud, waste, and abuse in your community. So let's get to it, and I'm happy to take questions at the end. So bidding basics, we're first going to look at what you'll be able to do after this presentation. You'll be able to identify who must follow Chapter 30B, or otherwise known as the Uniform Procurement Act. Identify Chapter 30B procurement processes related to supplies and services specifically, which are really driven by price thresholds, advertising, and recording requirements, and then identify some of the OIG resources, which I just mentioned to you. So with regard to Chapter 30B, what are the principles? So it's really structured. It was drafted around 4 different principles. The statute's been amended a couple of different times, typically really modifying the thresholds, increasing them as dollar values have gone up and items are more expensive. But it creates a uniform approach to promote competition and fairness when sourcing. So really the design of the statute was to promote an equal opportunity for all qualified vendors to participate in public contracts and eliminate favoritism. So any qualified business would be alerted to the opportunity to do business with the jurisdiction. It creates fair, robust competition, and it saves tax dollars ultimately if you're being governed by bids or quotes, which require the award of a contract to the lowest offer received always from a qualified vendor. And it promotes transparency, which creates confidence in government and fairness for taxpayers and vendors, and really supports the integrity of the process. And it's a scaled statute. It's relatively elegant. So larger contracts require more formal procedures, typically around the notice requirement, which people also call advertising. We're going to look at who the law applies to, because it applies to cities and towns, boards, commissions, counties, districts, regional school districts, and Horace Mann charter schools. General charter schools elect to follow Chapter 30B, but they're structured differently than regular schools. With regard to federal funding, so as a general principle, with regard to the Uniform Procurement Act, the source of funding really doesn't matter. Federal regulations often require jurisdictions to apply state and local procurement laws. We cited to the CFR that supports that. If there is a direct conflict, and this is really sort of a legal analysis, the direct conflict, then Chapter 30B is eclipsed. Typically, federal law does not eclipse local law as it relates to procurement. Federal law also has rules and guidelines related to open, fair competition when federal funding is being used. So the federal funding documents themselves may address or provide guidance about which laws to apply. And again, typically when you're talking about competition, you're talking about notice, which is advertising, and what that entails. So it's different depending on the estimated value of the contract. And then you're talking about also the fairness component, which means that the specifications or the scope of work are noticed and provided to everybody in the same way. So everybody's being measured by the same standards, the goalposts are in the same location. And then the contract award component, if you're using a solicitation of a price quotation in Chapter 30B or a bid, it requires you to award the contract to the lowest offer received from vendors. So federal statutes are very similar to state statutes, but typically the scale is bigger because more money is spent if it's outside of state law. But you want to look at, in particular, the disbursement, excuse me, of funds. So if it's reimbursed, if you're already buying the items and you're seeking reimbursement for them, you're following Chapter 30B because you haven't gotten the funds yet. If it's direct issuance of money, then you follow the federal requirements And typically those are consistent and require application of local law. So just sort of be aware of that. You can always do more, but you can't do less. So you can apply more stringent standards, but you can't apply less stringent standards. So you can always opt in for 30B. With regard to governmental bodies that are not subject to Chapter 30B, executive agencies of the Commonwealth are not, because they follow OSD. They have the Operational Services Division to oversee procurement and sourcing for the operations of the Commonwealth. They often attend our classes. They're buyers, just to really get a hand on what we're talking about with regard to local officials. You can always use statewide contracts in lieu or in place of Chapter 30B because they are already procured on a presumptive competitive basis. So what goes along with a statewide contract is a user guide. So you'll have multiple vendors offering maybe the same supplies on the statewide contract. The user guide assures those vendors that there's some competition among them. Typically they're big players. So if you're talking about office supplies, you might have Office Max, Office Depot, and Staples. The user guide will require you to contact source among that list and then award accordingly. Because those bigger vendors are almost using those contracts as sort of an advertising component with regard to their supplies. So state colleges and universities elect to follow Chapter 30B but are not required. County sheriff's offices and Commonwealth charter schools that I had mentioned before. Horace Mann is required to follow the statute, but Commonwealth charter schools are structured differently. They are structuring everything about the public education process differently. And so they are outside of the standard practices, but they do need to account for public money that they get from students that attend those schools. So if they're way off their budget and they're not following any competitive sourcing, that's problematic. So they elect first to start with Chapter 30B and usually then take it from there. So with regard to Chapter 30B, these are the components that it applies to. So it applies to the acquisition of supplies, services, and real property, as well as the disposal of surplus supplies. So if you're getting rid of an old vehicle or something like that. We don't go over that component in this particular bidding basics presentation, but surplus supplies is covered in our public procurement contracting class that we offer, as well as some other courses offered through the Massachusetts Certified Public Purchasing Official Program through our office. And it also covers the disposition, the disposal of real property, which could take place in a variety of ways, from an actual a sale or a lease or an easement. So there are different interests in real property. Real property is not covered in this presentation, but we also have an asynchronous class. It's self-paced online that you can take that covers the different components of real property within the Uniform Procurement Act. It's very different from supplies and services because real property is real different. The price thresholds are different, the advertising component is different, and the contract award component is also unlike other components of the statute, because the use of real property is often to achieve different policy objectives. So that keeps it interesting. Let's look at the procurement process thresholds under the Uniform Procurement Act. This is sort of what drives the different procedures that are required within the statute. So if you are sourcing supplies and services for less than $10,000, you apply what's called sound business practices. It's a very, very sort of broad standard with regard to sourcing supplies or services for less than $10,000. Then you have the requirement that you at least seek 3 written price quotations based off of a written purchase description for supplies or services between $10,000 but not more than $50,000. And if it's more than $50,000, you're in the most formal process, which is competitive sealed bids or proposals. So they're different in terms of their notice pieces. They're not quotes, solicitation of price quotations and bids are not different in terms of their specifications or scope of service requirements. Proposals are different there. And we're going to look a little bit more closely at those differences. But first, let's look at sound business practices. So what does that do? You're required to ensure the receipt of favorable pricing by periodically soliciting price lists or quotes. So the statute doesn't define periodic, and it doesn't define favorable. So you apply, it's a civil statute, you apply sort of the reasonable person standard, and it means that you're informed about the supplier service that you're getting a good price, it's not outrageous. You could check catalogs or price lists for supply costs or other jurisdictions for what they've paid for different services. So that's enough under sound business practices. What buttresses this in the statute in terms of compliance is a prohibition. There aren't a lot of prohibitions. The thou shall not. In Chapter 30B, they have thou shall, the mandatory affirmative acts in the statute to support open, fair competition, but the prohibition is that you can't bid split. So you can't, sound business practices is very broad. So you wouldn't, source the same supply, the same service multiple times a year under sound business practices, because that could be bid splitting. If there's a reasonable basis for doing that, then that supports that it's not. So I'm just sort of giving you a big broad overview and what we look for in terms of compliance with the statute. So with regard to sound business practices and its application maybe to a food source, fresh vegetables, you might be sourcing those multiple times a year. That would make sense. There's a rational basis for that. It wouldn't be bid splitting. But if it's the same item, if it's office paper from the same supplier and it's all under $10,000, or office supplies, I should say, then that looks a little problematic. So to buttress the proper use of sound business practices is a prohibition on bid splitting, or source splitting, I should say. The next level is written price quotations, which is sourcing supplies or services that are at least estimated to cost at least $10,000, but not more than $50,000. So you solicit, there are affirmative solicitations for 3 written price quotations. That solicitation is not defined. So that's unlike bids and proposals, which is very clearly defined. We'll look at that in a moment. But that solicitation could take place in a variety of ways. You could have local bylaws and rules that require you to post it on your website for a certain period of time, or make at least 3 phone calls or send it via email. So that solicitation could take place in a variety of ways. You need to solicit at least 3 sources that customarily provide that supply or service. That you receive them is not true, but you need to document your good faith effort. That documentation includes the email itself. And in this component, you can't negotiate price. So the interesting thing about the solicitation of price quotations between $10,000 and $50,000, this is used by a lot of small local jurisdictions. But Section 4 of the statute really is very clear about the contract award language, and the legislature has been approached by different groups, and they've been asked to allow for the use of requests for proposals, which we'll review in a minute, and that price is a factor in the contract award, but the legislature has not adopted that. So if you're operating in sourcing supplies and services under written price quotations, then you want a really firm purchase description, and you want to make sure you're sourcing what you want, because it is going to go to the qualified vendor. So they're responsive, they're giving you what you want, and the responsible vendor offering the lowest price supplier service. If that vendor is not responsible, if you've done work with them in the past and they haven't performed, they haven't showed up, they haven't done the work that they promised they would do, whatever the basis for their non-performance determination is, they're not then eligible to participate in that process. They would be deemed not responsible. You'd want to make sure that was documented and check with legal counsel, but only qualified vendors really are at play in this context. And I think sometimes we get calls on the 30B hotline from local jurisdictions that might be challenged by vendors who have not performed for them in the past, are now the lowest vendor in a solicitation of price quotation process. They think they're entitled to that award, and they're not if they're not a responsible vendor, or if they're not responsive, if they're not giving them what they want. So with regard to the solicitation and price quotation process, make sure you have a written purchase description and that it's accurate for what you want. All of the vendors have the same information, so this process is designed to be fair, to create an equal opportunity for every qualified vendor. And it must be a vendor that customarily provides the supplier service you seek. So in terms of the documentation, if it's, you're sourcing office supplies, I'm going to sort of basic, easy to understand, less complicated procurements. But if you're sourcing office supplies, then a response from Pet Depot would not be consistent with a vendor that customarily provides the supplier service. So all quotes must be in writing, and they must contain the date and time, and identify the best price from a responsible vendor. Here the phrase best price is used because we wanted to make sure that we included any revenue generating contracts in this context. If you are paying for the supplies or services or goods and services, then it's the lowest. If it's a revenue generating contract, then it's the highest. When you are in Section 4 of the statute, price matters. If you are using a request for proposal, it's just a factor. Remember also to include the right to cancel. And this happens if maybe the purchase description itself was inadequate, you didn't know it till it went out, you're not getting responses back that you want, and it's not going to meet your needs. You can cancel the process when it's in your best interest. There's no contract at play. So the Uniform Procurement Act from a legal perspective is very different than standard contract law. And for lawyers like me, this is always very interesting because the statute sort of takes over. It's almost like a strict liability statute. That a jurisdiction is making a request for quotes or offers from vendors doesn't mean it's necessarily going to engage in a contract. I think about it more as like the honeymoon period. You're not in a legally binding contract yet. And the sourcing part of it is a public process, and we care about it because we want to extinguish favoritism and promote fair competition for public money. So you can cancel the process and restart the procurement with a new purchase description. We know that like if this kind of thing happens, vendors might not be happy because their prices are out there, and it's in their information's out there in response to the solicitation, and that's a public document, so their competitors can get their hands on that. It's not a happy situation for vendors, but it does happen, and the jurisdiction's completely entitled to say, wait, we're not ready to go through with this. We're going to cancel the process. The statute is basically the affirmative acts are often related to notice and recording. So you need to record certain kinds of information according to the statute in order to have a valid procurement. The teeth in the statute is if you don't follow the law, you have an invalid contract. And what that means is there's no enforceable agreement. It's not a legally binding agreement, and no payment can be made by the jurisdiction. So that's unhappy for the vendor. It's unhappy for the jurisdiction in terms of its reputational interest. So if you don't follow the law, you don't record the right information, that is non-compliance with 30B. In the statute, it specifically says you have an invalid contract. There's case law that supports this. It's been challenged. The jurisdiction can't make payment to that vendor. So you need to have the names and addresses of all persons from whom quotations were sought, the written purchase description. In 2016, when the statute was amended, the written purchase description was actually codified within the statute because it didn't require writing before, which sounds small, but like if somebody was just making a bunch of phone calls, they might not record that down, and you're relying on their memory. If you're doing compliance reviews, the ways that you get evidence are through oral statements and interviews, and then the documentation in the file, and any other recording device. And you need the names of persons submitting the quotations and the date and amount of each quotation. So you're looking at those dates to make sure that they're received within a reasonable period of time. In the solicitation of price quotation zone, it is not the 2 weeks out from the due date like it is for bids and proposals. So that is a little bit more fluid. The quote zone is a little bit more fluid, as is business practices, but it still has to be reasonable, right? You wouldn't be conducting a quote process and get a quote in December and then, in January, February. You wouldn't get like 3 quotes over a 3-month period of time because that doesn't make sense. It's too far out. You can supplant the quote process with the bid process, which means you add formal advertising to it in a 2-week lead time. The statute specifically allows for this. It's section 5, and you adopt the advertising requirements. But you cannot do this for requests for proposals. We just want to make sure that we're communicating what the statute actually requires and what the legislature has contemplated already. So with regard to invitations for bids, that's one of the formal processes under the Uniform Procurement Act. If you are sourcing supplies or services for more than $50,000, you may use an IFB, and you would award the contract to the responsive and responsible bidder offering the best price. Again, we're using that phrase. It's the lowest price if you're purchasing. It's the highest price if it's a revenue generating contract. And you have the formal advertising piece. The other method with regard to the statute that you may use is a request for proposal, and the award of the contract is not dictated by price, but the specifications are different because you have what's known as evaluative criteria. I think of it as a grading rubric, but you need to apply the special language within the statute that the legislature chose to conduct that evaluation with regard to the responses that you receive back from vendors. So it's an alternative method to bids. It's not exclusively dictated by price, assuming they're responsive, they're giving you what you want, and they're responsible, they have the reputation to perform it. You're weighing the relative merits of the proposal, and price is just a factor. It's more time consuming than using a bid, but it does share certain steps that bids also use, which include preparation of the documents, the advertising and distribution of the documents. The advertising for requests for proposals are the same as bids. You receive, open, and record the bids or proposals. The opening component of a proposal is different than a bid because it's not a public document right away. You conduct an evaluation process, award the contract, and retain the record. So these are sort of the broad strokes of the different steps that take place. The bid submission requirements must state where and when the sealed bids are due and address where they're to be delivered, and any instructions on how to mark the bid packages. The maximum amount of time local jurisdiction would reserve before awarding the contract, and any instructions for correcting, modifying, or withdrawing the contract before the bid due date. So the advertising must, again, state where, when, and how, for how long the IFB may be obtained, and it describes the supplier services needed, the notice that you reserve the right to reject, and an identification of any board or other body that must approve the contract. So I think about this, sort of an easy translation of this is like a school committee might be the board that requires, that has to give approval. So the advertising component is an advertisement at least 2 weeks before the bid due date in a local newspaper. That did not go away in 2016, although we were deep into the digital era then. So the advertising in the local newspaper is generally an expense that's consistently absorbed by the local jurisdiction. Notice, so this is what, notice in a conspicuous location in or near your jurisdiction's offices. So that's what the statute says, or on an official bulletin board. So the conspicuous location could be a website. The Secretary of State has issued letters authorizing local jurisdictions to use their website as the conspicuous location. So that really, the statute was written to address things like not really posting, but maybe having the notice hidden away in a file, and then a contract gets awarded to a favored vendor. So all of these different steps are designed to undo any favoritism and promote fairness. The additional component that was added in 2016, which is sort of interesting, and I know it's been different for local jurisdictions, is posting notice digitally on the Combis system administered by OSD. So any qualified vendor can go in there and make an offer on your bidder proposal on Combis. So you are definitely getting a broader pool than you may have gotten in the past. You want to make sure that your responsibility determination is very sort of well known and written, like that you're able to assess those vendors, that they have all of the credentials that you require and things like that. So Posting notice on combis was to generate a bigger interest. So you might get, vendors around New England, you get vendors in other places, other states. If the estimated value of the supplies or services are more than $100,000, you post notice in the Goods and Services Bulletin with the Secretary of State's office. So there are different laws and different strands of different laws that achieve different things. The Secretary of State's office often goes to the public record component, transparency, as it relates to public transactions. So that's, state officials, local officials, and other public entities, public boards, and things like that. You receive, open, and record the bids. Open all of the bids at the same time specified in the IFB, so we have a uniform treatment of the bids. They are opened in an open meeting or in front of one or more witnesses. So if it's not an open meeting, then you have a witness there. Reject any late bids and keep a record of the names of all bidders and the amounts of the bids. So bids are public after the bid opening. They are available to the public and subject to a public records request. Follow the rules in your IFB. We're typically talking about the contract award language in that context. Be consistent and fair, and you're making a determination about whether the bidder is offering the lowest price if they are responsive and responsible. So that's the foundational component. If somebody offers you a low price for something and they're not giving you what you want, they make what is actually sort of considered in the legal world a counter offer of sorts, they're not eligible for consideration. Again, also, if they haven't performed for you in the past, they might be the lowest offer received, but they're still, if they don't have the reputation, they're not responsible, and they're not eligible for consideration in that process. So the final steps of an IFB are selecting the responsible and responsive bidder, offering the lowest price, you award and execute the contract, and then you retain the records. So the full life cycle of a procurement. You retain the records for 6 years after the date of final contract payment. So the contract could be 10 years, final payments made 10 years out. You retain those records for 6 years. The statute, you can keep digital records. That's one of the sort of modern questions we've been getting. So digital records, you can scan and save real property, save real estate, and keep it all on your network. Those are consistent with the statute. The statute doesn't, in very rare circumstances, distinguishes between paper records and digital records. Chapter 30B accounts for electronic bidding already and has for a long time. So the electronic or digital version is fine. And we just want to remind everybody to monitor vendor performance during the term of the contract, because this vendor might come back to you and they're not going to be eligible to participate in the process if they haven't performed in the past. So make sure that you have some mechanism in place to monitor that vendor. So next we're going to look at requests for proposals, which is also a procurement when you're sourcing supplies or services estimated to cost more than $50,000. It's a different process though. So the advertising component with regard to invitation for bids or IFBs is the same as it is for requests for proposals. The price threshold is the same. The advertising component is the same. But really when you're looking at the fairness piece or the specifications piece or scope of services piece, you're adding on a layer of the statute, and then the contract award piece is different. I look at it in 3 steps. So like, what's the advertising? What's the notice requirement? What's the statute require of me? What do I have to do in terms of specifications or purchase description, scope of services? And what do I have to do in terms of contract award? Requests for proposals are more flexible in terms of the contract award piece, but they have a lot of safeguards built in up front to ensure that the local jurisdiction is using the process appropriately and it's consistent with the public's desire. So the statute requires, if you're using a request for proposal, that you have a procurement officer. This is the bullet point here on this slide is the statutory definition of what that is. So if you don't have a procurement officer, there's a method for appointing one within your jurisdiction. They can also designate someone on their behalf to conduct this process. So oftentimes in bigger cities, we'll see, a chief procurement officer will designate the superintendent as the CPO for sourcing supplies and services and using RFPs for school-related procurements. So the chief procurement officer must be appointed. It's required by Section 6 of Chapter 30B, and they typically are the individual that's responsible for all activities related to the procurement of supplies or services, and they delegate those functions if you're a big entity. The other component, the recording requirement. So I talked to you about like the affirmative acts within the statute. It has recording requirements, and if you're using an RFP, you must document in writing the reason or the rationale for using an RFP. It doesn't have to be an elegant narrative. It's just that you may want to acquire a computer system that is most easily adapted to your existing software or something like that. It doesn't give you the language, but it says that you need to provide some rationale because you're going outside of the usual award process. So you explain why the selection of the most advantageous offer requires a comparative judgments of factors in addition to price. That's sort of the grading rubric or the rating system is the comparative judgments. Most advantageous is the language that the statute uses. That's in place of to the lowest offer received, to the lowest price, because price is just a factor. It's not binary. It's not dictating the outcome. The comparative criteria is a component that's essential to the purchase description, and you develop the comparative evaluation criteria for the specific feature that you might be willing to pay more money for. So this typically isn't for a supply. Sometimes it can be if we've seen it for vehicles that are hybrid vehicles. Sometimes that's an input to reduce carbon emissions. Local jurisdictions are converting to vehicles that have electric fuel for them, and that may be in the RFP that they use to source those vehicles. So we have seen it for supplies, but it's typically actually used more for services. The comparative criteria is rated. And I'll give you a sample of that in a minute, but this is a statutory language that's required when you're giving the rating. You could, if you want to go back to school and think about highly advantageous as an A student, advantageous as a B student, not advantageous as a C student. So they're not out. They're not out of the running. And unacceptable as sort of the D, F student. That's the rating system. That language needs to be used. There is a court case that evaluates this language, and it says, look, the legislature put it in there, and judges don't make the law, they interpret it if there's a gray area. This is not gray, this is the language that they said you need to use. So this is the rating system that is applied. If you're using this comparative criteria as a component of your RFP, you already have quality requirements, things that vendors have to give you if they want to be responsible. Those are binary. So a quality requirement could be related to licensing. That's the floor. You could have a vendor with unacceptable ratings that extinguishes the comparative criteria, but they offer a price that's so attractive, they still may be eligible for the award of the contract. There's no guaranteed outcome here because you have this piece to it. And identifying what's most advantageous for a jurisdiction is up to that jurisdiction. The statute doesn't say. The rating process and the evaluative criteria is designed to balance that level of discretion to promote fairness. So you're specifying in the request for proposal any factor that differentiates a rating. So we use experience here to sort of illuminate what that means. A highly advantageous rating might be for criteria that you're assessing that the proposer, the vendor, must have 5 or more years of experience providing, municipal billing. An advantageous rating might be that the proposer has 3 or more years of experience, but less than 5, providing municipal billing. So that's how you would apply the rating system to the criteria that you're looking at and what you might be willing to pay more money for. So to link that back to the rationale for using an RFP, you could say you need a municipal billing service that's very predictable, and you found that 5 or more years of experience gives you that, so you want to apply the system. That's sufficient. So then the proposal submission an opening takes place, the price and the non-price proposals must be in sealed separate envelopes. So we say envelopes because we're envisioning the analog version. There's definitely an electric version of this where you keep them, separate from each other. It's not a public process. They're not open publicly, but you need to have a witness there. And the non-price proposals must be opened at a time specified in the request for proposal, like a bid, in front of one or more witness. And the only public document is a register of proposals to be prepared and made available for public inspection. So I can look and see if my competitor actually is engaging in the same process I'm in, so I can get my ducks in a row and think like it's likely that they'll get awarded this contract or me, because I've seen this play out before. As a private, vendor, you can then allocate your resources accordingly. With regard to the evaluation process, the individuals responsible for evaluating non-price proposals may not see the price proposals until the evaluation of the non-price proposal is complete. So that means, the CPO might hold on to the price, send off the technical aspects or the non-price proposal to the school board. I'm imagining the school committee as the committee that's applying the evaluative criteria. And then they come up with their outcomes, and the most advantageous proposal is selected, taking into consideration the technical aspects of the proposal and the price. The CPO does that. All of these steps are outlined in the statute. They're actually reviewed in an asynchronous class that we offer online in more detail. In terms of getting this process right. If you've done it before, this might be old hat. If you haven't, it seems like a lot, but it's just something that you need to sort of get used to and have a checklist to make sure you're in compliance with the statute. The last recording requirement is a written explanation if the best price proposal is not selected. In other words, you didn't get the Cadillac, you didn't get the Prius, you got the sort of middle of the road car. You're not, price wasn't determinative, but you're not overspending either. So that's another documentation requirement, or record requirement, according to the statute. Every law, I know I'm bumping up, I have probably about 5 minutes left. So every law is written, generally you have the law itself, what it applies to, and then you have exemptions. There's a section related to exemptions. 30B actually does have some exemptions, typically related to services that already have a floor. They're licensed services like lawyers, you have a bar, or CPAs or engineers, and that's exempt from the statutory process, which doesn't mean you can't elect to apply it, but you're not required to. So you have you have the law, what it applies to, and then you also have sort of exceptions to the rules, which are not the same things as exemptions. That doesn't mean you're outside of the statute. You're still in the statute, but in this scenario, the rules are a little bit different. And that's where we come to emergency procurement. So emergency procurements are contemplated within the statute. Any emergency has a temporal aspect to it, which is timing or exigency. And that's a factor. That's what's sort of looked at. So emergency procurements are allowed for under the statute. You comply with the statute to the extent possible. Any emergency is a person or their property could be endangered, the health or safety of people or their property. You follow the statute to the extent practicable. We know what that means. We know that actually goes to the advertising piece. If you do a statewide contract, you're in compliance with the statute. You can go directly to a statewide contract to look at what you can procure. In the context of COVID, there's definitely some PPE contracts where the supply chains have been stabilized and checked, and they're on the statewide contract. We have a COVID-19 tile on our website, but also there are lots of state agencies that have assistance as it relates to those kinds of things. But with regard to Chapter 30B, you follow it to the extent practicable. Shorten the advertising period. Often it's just written quotes, and procure only what's necessary. This component of the statute, it's Section 8 of the statute, sometimes can be abused because we've seen procurements for more than what just the emergency required, and there were no breaks on that procurement. They're outside of their budget. It makes it hard for that local jurisdiction to stabilize their budgeting process, and that's problematic. So what 30B requires is that there's a basis, for determining that the emergency exists. And when you conduct that procurement, you identify the emergency, the vendor's name, contract amount, and type, any list of the supplies or services procured, and procedures used to solicit competition. Phone calls and emails count, so those are procedures. The other end, as soon as possible, you submit the emergency procurement to the goods and services bulletin. That's the public notice that this took place. So there's no, you'll notice, I'm sure there's no price threshold on emergency procurements. You're still in the statute. You follow the statute to the extent possible. No artificial, you can't artificially create an emergency. So we've seen this again for delayed maintenance. And that's it. I'm just going to touch on a few more things within the statute that are sort of you need to know. I mentioned before that any contract that's awarded in violation of 30B is not actually a contract, and it's invalid. No payment can be made. The other component to that is minor informalities will not invalidate a contract. So if you know, a bid submission has a decimal point maybe in the wrong place, it's obvious. You can make that determination facially in the documents. That's a minor informality. That's an example of it. But it's not if just one vendor keeps has, you know, a $70,000 contract. There's been no Chapter 30B procurement procedure applied. That's an invalid contract. Payments can be stopped, and I've definitely seen that done. So retain all written records required by Chapter 30B, 6 years from the date of final payment. And remember, there's a prohibition on any bid splitting, so that's really working only within sound business practices and having a series of small contracts to avert notice to the market that these opportunities are available. We have lots and lots of resources for you guys if you need to go back and sort of understand things. This is just sort of a quick overview. We have procurement manuals. We have a Chapter 30B manual. We have a design and construction contracting manual, all that outline what the statutory requirements are. We have an OIG bulletin, which is a quarterly bulletin that's published with frequently asked questions related to procurement. We also work with other agencies who might put in new case law related to public records or construction. We have COVID-19 updates for you. And we have our official Massachusetts Certified Public Purchasing Official Program. All of our classes are online now, and they're either like this in a webinar style format on a system called Blackboard, which is a learning management system, but it's still webinar style. It's real time, it's synchronous, and we have asynchronous self-paced classes specifically related to supplies and services contracting. There's a module that is very detailed around requests for proposals, so you get more information on that. If that felt like a lot and you haven't done it before, there's more support for you to make sure that you sort of really understand the process. And then we also have real property transactions under Chapter 30B as a separate asynchronous class. Real property transactions are really different. The price thresholds are different. Advertising component is different. As you can imagine, it's longer because it's real property. There's lots of interested parties. And the contract award piece is really different. You could structure it as a bid or a proposal. Oftentimes they're called proposals because you're achieving some other public policy objective, whether that be affordable housing, you're acquiring land to build something like affordable housing or schools, or it's different. And for now, there are no in-person classes. We don't know when that will be. We have a bunch of different social media accounts. If you want to keep up to date, you please feel free to follow us. And that is it, I think, for just a really sort of broad strokes about what the Uniform Procurement Act requires. And again, if you're using federal funds, make sure you follow what the federal funds require. Typically, local laws, state laws, local ordinances, and bylaws are consistent with that. You can always do more, you can't do less. And if there's a direct conflict, you default to the source of money. Typically with 30B, where that money is coming from, and it doesn't matter if you're buying supplies, services, or you're conducting a real property transaction, you're applying the statute. And I think that's about it. I'm happy to take any questions.
All right, does anyone have questions? I do have, Kathleen, how about you go?
Hi, thank you, Maya. That was awesome. I'm brand new to the position, so I really appreciate this. I was just wondering, is this presentation going to be available? Are you emailing it out to us so we can review it?
I think Jennifer you have the recording of, yeah, so I think you guys have this, what was just recorded with the slide. So I think that is going to be probably sent in the form of a link.
Yes, Jennifer's wonderful, and she actually posts each meeting and the presentations on the CAPPO website, which can be found at the Barnstable County Purchasing website.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Hi, I have a question, Laura from Yarmouth. We were talking about rejecting late bids. So I
Yes.
did a cleaning bid not too long ago, and somebody came in like 45 minutes too late, and I told him I can't accept your bid. I can't take it, rejecting it. He still wanted to give it to me. Do I still have to hold on to that, or can I just throw it away?
Oh, he still wanted to give it to you, so he wanted to make it a public record?
Yeah, and I'm like, what am I supposed to do with this now? Because I told him and I haven't even opened it. I'm like, because I can't open it. I can't look at it.
Yeah.
It's not part of the contract. So I didn't know if I can just throw it away,
Dispose
or
of it,
do
yeah.
I need to keep it? I mean, right now I've just kept it, and I just put a note on there that said this was 45 minutes late and it's not going to be opened.
People are so interesting. So I think with regard to that, 30B doesn't speak to, it speaks to that it has to be on time. If it's late, it's late. It's a record retention issue, and the Secretary of State's office publishes a municipal record retention schedule. It's on their website. And some things fall within administrative use. And what that means is you get, it's satisfied the transaction, whatever happened, then it's done and you get rid of it. It's not, I don't know if that was ever sort of converted into an actual bid document because it was late. I think that's sort of the thrust of the question, like, is this now a bid document that I have to keep 6 years from final payment on this whole? I would imagine that it was late, so it didn't convert. And according to the record retention schedule, it might have in there, like late bids almost seems like it's oxymoronic, right? You could go into the record retention schedule, press F2 for a search and type in late bids, see if anything comes up, and then evaluate administrative use. If it's administrative use, which is in my mind, that's sort of the direction that it's going, because it didn't actually grow up and become a bid because it was thwarted in that process, that it's then disposed of. I find it unusual that they gave it to you to keep, because while you have it, before it's disposed of, if someone said, if they make a records request for all of the bid, I guess it wouldn't even be a bid document, but all documents received, it depends on the nature of the request, that could be swept within it, which is probably what your concern is. So you got a hot potato, you want to make sure you manage it. I would go into there's also an attorney of the day at the Secretary of State's office that you can call and ask them about that question, because it's really a public records question.
Could I possibly chime in?
Yes, please.
Hi, this is Leanna Serdat. I'm the Assistant Administrator for the Town of Orleans. And I just wanted to mention that this has happened in our history as well. And the way we dealt with it was we issued a cover letter, and we actually sent a bid back with the cover letter stating that it was refused because it was in late.
Oh, then you're creating a record
and also
that supports that. That's makes sense too.
Also, may I also add to it?
Yes.
This is Michaela Medeva, procurement coordinator with the Town of Orleans. We have actually addressed this issue since it happened. I wasn't here, but since then we have in our bid documents a language that says late bids will be rejected and returned unopened.
Oh, that's good. Yeah. So then you have a preemptive statement that tells the vendor specifically what you're going to do, which is helpful, because then I think that creates consistency from a policy perspective. So Chapter 30B will tell you, like, these are the affirmative acts that you need to do in order to comply with the statute, but it doesn't address everything. And this is definitely sort of a gray area, and it's a public record. But I think what the two women just said is like, oh, okay, so well, this is what we do with those public records. You create a form letter, and you provide notice in your bid documents, like, hey, if you're late, this is what we're going to do. Because the reality is, they're taking up real estate in your office. They're creating this potential wrinkle as it comes to a public records request. So it's a preemptive disclosure that this is what's going to happen if this happens. Because the reality is, unfortunately, for whatever reason, people are late with their bids. 45 minutes is really late. Like 2 minutes is when you feel like, oh my God, I feel really bad for you, but it's late. So good question though. And thank you ladies for contributing. Anything else? Any questions about like we've gotten, so we created a COVID-19, what we call a button on our webpage related to frequently asked questions concerning procurements around COVID. So we hope that's helpful to people. We know it's an incredibly difficult situation. People want to do the right thing, and the hard thing, it's a budget buster. And even if you're getting federal funds, it's not in real time. It's hard. Like, we're all in a very difficult situation. I deeply appreciate the attendance that we have in our classes, because I know that people are really trying to get it right. They want to make sure, hey, we still want open, fair competition. We got to stabilize. What am I supposed to do? So the statute does take into consideration emergencies. You do the best that you can with regard to the notice component. Statewide contracts are presumptively compliant because they are competitively procured for you. You're riding the coattails of like a massive, large scale purchase by the state. And our 30B hotline is there to sort of walk you through things. We don't necessarily have a bright line answer, and we can't provide you with individual legal advice. If you do have like a hardcore legal question, go to your local counsel. And in other ways, we try to provide lots of information on our website too.
Great. Well, thank you so much. That was a great presentation. I know that we all certainly learned some things from that. Jennifer Freitz is here, and next on the agenda, she's going to give us an update on the Barnstable County bids. So welcome, Jennifer.
Hi. So much. I'm so sorry I was late. All right. So at the current time, we have, let's see, the Barnstable County tradesperson's bid is out there right now. I actually extended it an additional week, hoping to kind of catch everybody at this meeting and extend kind of the opportunity to have everybody contact their contractors if they're not currently on our trade contract, to get them on there. I've already received actually a couple of submissions, which is great. We have some companies that were on there previously and missed, you know, our tradesperson contract last year, so we're able to get them back on, hopefully. But this is the opportunity to get your small contractors for, you know, small projects under 50K, get them on our trades directory in our trades contract. So that's going to be due next week on the 4th. Let's see, we have the roadway, public works, and miscellaneous materials. That has been awarded. Contracts went out yesterday. I know one pending question that I just received from someone is the status on K5, otherwise known as highway safety systems. All of the towns were pretty much in consensus, didn't want to be kind of the odd man out, if, you know, kind of show a united front. We did receive, you know, some negative feedback from the town of Barnstable. There were mixed reviews on their references. So that was enough to reject them and go to the second low bidder. So K5 is actually going to be talking to the town of Barnstable to kind of fix some of those issues that they had still pending. And hopefully next time that they bid in the future, you know, they'll be in a much better standing and we'll be able to accept their bids. Also, I am putting out today for next week, it'll be available to the public, any of the items that were not bid, so that we have an opportunity for those companies that for whatever reason didn't submit towards the public works and miscellaneous materials. I think crack sealant was a big one that we were still waiting on. So I'm putting it back out there for those that we didn't receive any bids for. And let's see, roadway specific projects, those contracts also went out yesterday. I'm sorry, the contract award went out yesterday. We're waiting for their payment bonds and insurance. Contracts are completed. They're just waiting for those documents to be sent out for signature. Golf course materials, that had to be rebid. There were there was a little bit of confusion because it's such a complex bid with the different chemicals and everything like that, and trying to get a good apples to apples comparison. So that is actually being rebid at the moment. It is due to go out next week, and then bids will be due February 19th. The porta potties, we have a couple of towns that participated in that. Evaluations are currently underway. I'm hoping by tomorrow to connect with everybody. So if I haven't had a chance to connect with you, I apologize. Hoping to connect with those towns tomorrow so that we can get it awarded, hopefully by the next commissioners meeting next week. Trades, and I think that's it for you guys. And then the rest, I have other bids for our internal departments. That's a whole other status for a different group. Any questions? There was a lot of info, I'm sorry.
Thank you for doing all of that. I know Town of Barnstable, we appreciate it so much. We really utilize those tradesperson contracts. So thank you very much for all your work.
Absolutely.
I have a quick question on the tradesperson contracts, the under 50,000. That's for the labor only.
Correct.
Is that right?
Yes.
Okay.
All right, so then next on the agenda, I just want to put out to the group if you have any requests for speakers for our next meetings. We are still trying to schedule a date with the State Diversity Office to figure out these new MBE, WBE requirements and how we should go about updating our policies. We have had 2 meetings scheduled with them, but unfortunately they've had to cancel on us. So we're still trying to get them here as a speaker. I know a number of our members have voiced concerns about just not fully understanding how to make our policies match theirs or what exactly their changes mean for our bid processes. So we're looking for clarification from them. Jennifer and I are still trying to get them to come and speak to us. So that is still on the table. But from other members, what other speakers or presentations are you looking for?
Ready?
Quiet crowd today.
I know. It's early.
One thing we had thought about doing is trying to get a presentation about that real estate portion of Chapter 30B. I know it's something a lot of towns aren't always doing. So then when it comes to the time that you're getting a lease together or you're trying to acquire property, it's a little bit confusing. So that's something that's on the table for a presentation as well. But we just want to welcome all of our members to email us with your ideas. We're always open to what everyone's needs are. So please just make sure you keep those lines of communication open and let us know as members what you guys are looking for.
I have one other question for Maya about the RFP process. If we've got a committee of say 6 people and we're grading everybody to highly advantageous, and 5 of us said highly advantageous and 1 person didn't. What we did right now is we kind of brought it to our chief procurement officer, but I wasn't sure if that was the necessary step. Can it just be like a 5-to-1 vote?
So the statute doesn't address that particularly with regard to that piece of it, like the evaluation of the technical aspects of the proposals and the ratings. Theoretically, once the price is open, the chief procurement officer could, it's a factor in that whole decision. I think as a group, though, it's best to unify it, and putting it to a vote would make sense because then you're just doing a simple majority, right?
Yeah, and so we haven't opened the prices yet because we can't come to a conclusion. So that's
but that ultimately, with regard to the ratings, in some ways they're soft. They're instructive, but then the hard part would be if all the prices were super clumped together and all the ratings likewise were clumped together, right? Like it's there's not a lot of room. That's not usually the case, because I think the market research that's done beforehand will show, oh, there's a huge range. We want to use this process because we might be willing to pay more, but we're going to do that based off of this feature, this component of it. Typically, it's the chief procurement officer that sort of does the final assessment. I think it's hard because you want to, yeah, it sounds like you want to get a unified vote. It's sort of like when an official appointment is made, you usually don't see a fracture, you see unanimous in that. So, I mean, if you can't resolve it together, then I think really the only way to do it is by a simple majority.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
All right, everyone. So we are at 10 o'clock. So if no one else has any questions or comments, then I think we can end our meeting. So I'll move to make a motion to adjourn this meeting. A second, anyone?
I'll second.
Thank you, Laura. All right, all in favor, everyone raise their hands. That's on camera.
Thank you so much for having me, everybody. Have a great day.
Thank
Thank
you.
you,
You as
Maya.
well, Maya.
Take care.
So our meeting is adjourned, and our next meeting will be sending out that notice with the agenda later on. Again, if you have any speaker ideas, please contact us and let us know. Okay. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you.